All right, welcome. I am very excited for this video and the next one. It's going to be a two-part series. And in all honesty, this is something that I've probably started 3 or 4 times now and just haven't really felt like I get it quite right. But I think it's going to be a great tool for you if you are learning how to use Azure, if you are working through some of the AZ 801 content that I've already been creating and you've been following along, or if you just need a lab environment with Active Directory that you can spin up and monkey around with and destroy and not worry about impacting something in production. This video series is going to be covering how to use a Microsoft Quickstart template for spinning up an Active Directory environment. That's going to be part one. And then part two is going to be how do we take that template, customize it a little bit, and then give ourselves the ability to deploy more of a lab environment rather than just a domain controller. So part one, we're going to be spinning up just a single DC. We're going to be walking through how to use the Quickstart template, how it works. And then I'm going to be walking through the pricing involved, how much it really costs to run this lab, and how you can tweak it a little bit to lower the cost or save yourself cost if you want to keep it around for a little while. And then finally, we're going to connect to the domain controller, and I'm going to give you a quick config script that you can run to give yourself a really basic starting Active Directory environment. Now, all of these resources we're using today are publicly available. I'll put links in the description. And I'm going to, the reason I decided to break this up in a two-part series is this first step, this first video is really easy. It's going to get you up and running. It only takes a couple minutes to get the deployment started. It does take a little while to spin up, but then the amount of customization you can do after the fact, once you've kind of done this a couple of times and you see the work involved, there's quite a bit of things you can do to make your life easier on top of giving you a lot of extensibility to customize the lab for whatever scenario you're trying to accommodate for. So with that being said, let's skip the intro at this point and get right into spinning up our lab environment. I'm going to cut over to my browser here, and right here you have a link to a page that's hosted by Microsoft. This is on Microsoft's documentation domain, learn.microsoft.com, and this is a template that they provide you to spin up a domain controller in your Azure environment. Now, what I'm going to do here is I'm going to get this process started so you can see it. And then once it's started, it takes about 17 minutes to deploy. So we're going to take a step back and let's look at what you're getting once you deploy this template and what that's going to look like cost-wise. Because if you're like me, you don't want to spend money unnecessarily in Azure, and it is a little bit intimidating to get started because there is a cost associated with everything, and you don't really want to run the risk of accidentally creating something that's going to cost you $100, and that's a really expensive headache for no reason, right? So let's get this started. It's really easy. From this page, we are going to click this Deploy to Azure button, and it reroutes you back to your Azure tenant. So you do need an Azure subscription for this, but you can also use, I believe, the free student sign-up credits. And the template itself takes you to this form in your tenant and gives you a number of fields that you can fill out to customize the deployment. So I'm just going to run through these fields really quick. Select the resource group I want to deploy it into. You set an Azure admin username and password. This is for your test domain that you're spinning up. Use my same lab username and password I use for everything. And then you specify the domain name that's going to get configured after the VM starts. And I usually have a dzab.local, but I'm going to go contoso.com because I've got post-config scripts, and I just want to make sure they work if I'm not using the same values I always use, because I want to make sure the scripts work for you guys if you're going to do this on your own. This DNS prefix, you can use anything. This is actually a DNS prefix that you can use to connect to your VM once it's spun up. It does have to evaluate to make sure it's a global unique name or unique in your region. And then this VM size, this standard size works and is kind of recommended, but you can scale this down if you want something that's a little bit less expensive. Like this B2S series is less expensive than the D2 series, so I'm going to choose this one to run it with. It does make your VM a little bit slower, but if you're spinning up a lab environment, it doesn't really matter. So I'm sizing down to B2S. Leave these two fields as is. We might talk about that in the next video. Location can stay as is as well. And then you have a whole bunch of predefined values here that are already set for naming your VM, your virtual network, the IP space, and then some of the other resources that's created. So this is as simple as it is. I've set up basically username and password, chose the VM size, told it what I want the domain name to be, and now I can do review and create, and hit create, and we're off and running. Getting your own lab environment in Azure is basically this simple. So when you trigger this deployment, it takes you to the deployment screen, and you're going to see that it's starting to run through all the different resources that's created. But like I mentioned at the beginning of the video, this does take about 15 to 20 minutes to deploy. I think my average is right around 17 minutes, and that's pretty consistent. But that's not it just creating the resources. That's it creating the resources. Then once the VM is created, it installs and uses DSC to push an Active Directory configuration. So it installs Active Directory, it restarts the domain controller, it configures your domain settings based on what the input that you just provided, and you're off and running. After that, it gives you basically an IP address, or you can use the DNS name or the IP address to connect to your VM, and you have your lab. So while this is going, I'm going to take a step back and let's talk about price. Now, as a real simple rule of thumb, this to run just this VM in a lab environment for a few hours costs me less than a cup of coffee from Starbucks. Significantly less, actually. I think it might cost me just a couple bucks if I'm only running this VM. But normally, if I'm doing lab work, and you've followed around some of my other videos, I usually have a management server, a domain controller, and I'm running one or two other servers depending on the use case that I'm doing in my video that I'm labbing, failover clusters, logging, monitoring, authentication policies and silos, that sort of stuff. So it usually costs me about $3 to do my lab prep work that I'm doing for the videos, and in every case I'm doing this also for a class that I run every Wednesday. So I usually spin up the VM one or two times throughout the week, and then again I spin up all the same VMs from scratch for class so I can do the same demos live in front of students. And yeah, it costs me $3. I think I spent $8 once on my most expensive week, and that was failover clusters where I had 4 VMs, and also the lesson on Azure Firewall, because that's a little bit more expensive. That cost me some money, but that's separate from this. So knowing prices are there, let's look at what's involved in this deployment so you guys can understand, and I can show you how you evaluate price anytime you want to spin up something in a lab environment. So let me really quick go back to that Quickstart page. I just got to find my link here. Bam. All right. So this is a Microsoft hosted docs page, right? But right here, I can go to browse code, and I can open the page in GitHub, and you can see the actual configuration that is running this deployment. So you don't need to understand what all these are, but if I click into one of these, I'm trying to think of what might be simplest for a reading format. I'm going to do the bicep file. These, you have all your parameters defined. These are the things that you input when you click deploy, but down here it goes over the resources that are created. So it creates a public IP address that's needed for you to be able to connect to the VM. And if I look at public IP address pricing, I don't think that's that page. This is an estimate. I don't know if they're using basic or standard. We can look after the fact. But this is either costing 0.0036 cents per hour or half a cent per hour. Let's just assume it's a standard regional one, and you're looking at half a cent per hour. That means for 2 hours of lab work, or 3 hours of lab work, let's go with 3 as a baseline, that's 1.5 cents to run. Obviously, this varies based on your region. If you are in Qatar Central, looks like the pricing is the same. So pricing is pretty cheap for public IP. Now let's go back here. What's the next resources? Availability sets don't cost money. The VMs in them do. VNets don't cost money. Load balancers do cost money. So let's look at the price of load balancer. I have that tab up here. This is going to be cost for the first 5 rules. This is spinning up one rule. So this is our price. We are paying 25 cents an hour. So for 3 hours, that's actually 0.025 cents an hour. So that's 7.5 cents. So we're up to 8 cents for 3 hours of lab work for the load balancer and pricing. That's pretty straightforward. So let's keep looking at our deployment here. Network interfaces are free. virtual machines cost money. So this comes back to what we selected for our virtual machine size in that deployment template, and there's some variability here. But let's look at virtual machine pricing and see how much this costs. Let's see if there's a good chart here. I think this is a little bit difficult because of the different sizes that are available. So if I type in the SKU, I wonder if I get a better chart. Oh, here we go. Okay, so it's down here. So we use B2S. So if I scroll down, there's a lot of different VM SKUs, so it can be kind of difficult to find pricing for VMs. But the reason the reason I'm doing this live with you in this video is because I want you to see anytime you're creating a resource in Azure, it's really easy to determine how much it's going to cost you if you know about how long it's going to be. And in any sort of lab work, I've done a lot of different random labs. I always look at the price first, and it can be a little bit tedious sorting through and finding what the actual price is going to be for the resources you're trying to create, but this is a really good discipline, personal discipline to get into for yourself if you're doing lab work in Azure. It also helps justify, is it really worth my time to do this, especially when you see this is only costing me a couple cents, a couple dollars. So right here my price is in month, right? Because it expects that you're paying monthly for this. A VM's not just going to spun up and destroyed, but we're doing lab work. So up here with display pricing, but let's change this to hour and scroll back down. Let's do B2S. V2, that's fine. Okay, so this VM is costing me, I don't know what AHB is. I don't think it matters. This is costing me 8.3 cents an hour. Now you remember we're paying, was it 8 cents an hour for the public IP and the load balancer? So this cost me another 8 cents. So for 3 hours we have 24 plus 8, 32 cents for 3 hours worth of work for a VM. This isn't including storage, but storage is pretty trivial. That's also going to be a couple cents. So what this goes to show is if I'm looking at my pricing accurately to run this one lab VM based on the deployment template that they created, I'm looking at paying about 32 cents an hour, or 32 cents for 3 hours. Pretty cheap. I think this is a really good demonstration. There's a very low threshold for you getting up and running with your own labs in Azure. You can do this with any Azure resource. Just look at the cost, and usually you come to find out if you're only paying for this for a couple hours and you're willing to do the extra step of creating the resources when you need them, configuring them, and then destroying them when you're done, and only working for whatever hours you have time to study with, it gives you a lot of flexibility to spin up whatever resources you want and learn whatever you want and get first-hand experience with it in an environment that doesn't matter if you break anything, and you're good to go. So with that being said, let's go back to our deployment here, and you'll see that it's already created all my resources, and it's on this step for creating AD Forest. This is the step that's going to take about probably 15 minutes to complete. So if I look, we start at 10:04, it's 10:12, I probably have another 8 minutes. I'm going to pause the video, and we're going to come back in a little bit, and then we're going to do I'm going to show you how we can connect to this. I'm also going to show you how I normally customize this to simplify it a little bit, and then we're going to connect to the domain controller, and I will show you the script that I run to do a really basic Active Directory configuration on the domain controller once it's stood up. If you do this every time, that allows you to spin up the DC when you need it, assuming you give yourself the lead time for the deployment, connect to it, run a script to configure everything, and now you have a very basic AD environment that you can use for any sort of lab work you have. So I'll be back in 2 seconds and we'll get that done. Alright, our deployment is now complete. Let's take a look at the resources that we've got. This is going to match what we saw in that deployment file. You have the availability set, load balancer, your VM and its NIC, the public IP, a couple of data disks, and a virtual network. And then you can ignore these. These are my own files. So we're all set. So if I want to then connect to this virtual machine that I stood up, I've got two options. The simple way, the way that I normally do it, is if you go click on your public IP, you'll see, well, this is how you do both ways. You see the public IP address, so I can RDP directly to that, or you should be able to also RDP to this domain name. Now let's switch to my desktop view, desk fit, and open RDP. And sorry, it's the reason I don't usually use this view is it's very high resolution. So let's copy that DNS name, paste that in here, and hit connect, and it should prompt me for credentials. So I'm going to use a different account so I can enter my domain credentials. And if you remember, I specified the username, my admin username when I was going through the deployment as dzabinski.da, and then the domain name that I used was contoso.com. So I'm doing username at contoso.com to give myself a UPN to log into, and then the password that I set in that deployment template as well. Hit OK, and it did not like my credentials. Let's try one more time. All right, so it's not liking this. Let's go take a closer look at what might be failing. So if I go back to here and I go to inputs, so what I switched back to here, let me give you a better cam. I went back to the deployment template. Now let's back out of this so I show you how to navigate this. If I'm in the resource group with my files, and this is the resource group that I targeted in the deployment template that I deployed. If I go to under settings and deployments here, you can see your deployment history. Now I want to go to the template that I deployed today at 10:24 a.m. and I go to inputs. You can then see the values that you specified here for the template details. So I've got my domain name, I've got my username. This all looks right actually. But it's not letting me connect. So let's try a different login method. I've never actually logged in using the DNS name. It does look like it works, but let's try the IP address, and rather than using a UPN, I'm going to see if I can just do the NetBIOS style name, not NetBIOS, the old school name where it's contoso / and then my admin username. So switch back here. Oop. Let me do that zoomed in view so this is just a little bit easier to read. So let's go back to my resource group, go to my public IP, copy the IP address, paste that in here. I still get a login prompt. And just to be safe, let's copy the values directly from the template. So deployments, template, inputs. I've got my domain name of contoso.com. That's copied. Let's do contoso / and then we'll copy the admin username. And as long as I didn't make a typo, there we go. So that's it. So I changed the username format and allow me to connect, and you'll see I'm connected to advm.contoso.com. This is the domain name I specified. This is the virtual machine name that's down here, right there. So I'm connecting to my lab environment. Now I'm going to hit yes here, and let me switch to an actual RDP view. And what we have here is going to take a little while to come up because it's the first time we've logged in, like any server. But what we'll have is a functioning Windows domain controller with an Active Directory domain with no settings deployed, right? So with any sort of DC, you'll have Active Directory, you'll have DNS, and that is about it out of the box. But we now have a lab environment that we can do whatever we want in. So if I look here, just to open a couple of things, I can open AD, and then let's open DNS just to pull them up. I got DNS, I've got my forward lookup zone for my domain right here in my one VM in the environment. Let's wait for Active Directory to come up. Maybe. There we go. I never have patience for this. And right here I've got my contoso.com domain with your very default settings. You got your built-in groups, no computers, you have one domain controller, and that's about it. Now, if you want to just start here, there you go. That's as simple as it is. But what I've also done is I've configured a script. It's under my GitHub account, which is Dan Zab, and then the repo name is AZ801, because I've been using this for the AZ801 exam content that I've been doing. If I go there, I've got a script I can use to do some very basic Active Directory configuration. So let's switch back to my browser here, and I already have my repo open. Like I said, danzab/az801 if you want to find this for yourself if you're doing this. If you click into Active Directory, I have a configure AD PS1 script right here. So let me just copy raw data and go back to my VM. Run as admin, just in case I need admin credentials, and paste. Now, this is the script that I've got. I should be able to run this out of the box if I did everything correctly, but like I said, every time I've spun up this lab environment, I use my dzab.local domain name. This is the first time I've done this using contoso.com, so a different domain name. So it should prompt me and it should just work. Now, let's run through this from top to bottom and show you what it's doing. So it creates a few OUs, and if you're going to customize this, feel free. All you have to do, this is an array, all you have to do is literally comma, whoops, man, if I can type, new line, and then new OU. And anything you add to this variable will get created for you. I'm going to leave this here just so you can see. And then it's going to go through and create those OUs. It also creates a couple of subdirectories based on the OUs that I have specified here. This is to go along with some of the content you might see in the Active Directory related videos for AZ801 for like managing delegated access and stuff like that. It also creates a bunch of users. Now, this users is also an array, but the array consists of multiple objects. So if you want to add different users than were listed here, you can copy one of these and paste and customize this to say my user, and then you'll notice this is a service account, right? The type is specified there. That's going to dictate what OU it's placed in. But if I want to do a user instead, let me copy these values. We'll do my user, and you can set the first and last name. I literally used ChatGPT to just generate this list. And then the type here dictates that it's placed in the people OU that's created, and then you'll notice there are a couple different types down here, and that's going to be admin. These admin users are either going to be DA for domain admins or ADM for like an admin, like an elevated privilege account, and that's why the type is admin. And when it creates the users, it goes through, creates them in a different OU based on the type that you have specified, and then if it's admin, it might also add them to groups, which is happening down here once I provision groups. Groups is exactly the same way. I've got a list of groups that are created. You can copy these objects and create new ones if you want to provision additional groups when you run the script. Otherwise, the out of the box stuff will be fine. And then after you created those, it goes through each group. It also will go through and add users. So if it's a -DA account that you've created, it'll add them to domain admins. If it's /ADM, it adds them to server admins, which also links with the GPO that configures server admin rights. This region doesn't actually do anything. You can ignore it. This is kind of something I was using to move servers to OUs after I created them. Doesn't matter. And then finally, it creates a handful of GPOs. Now, I have one typo here. Let me make a note so I can fix that script, so that next time when you guys run it, you don't have to watch for that. But this is going to create a couple of GPOs for firewall RDP admins, and then this is a little more complicated because it's supposed to go and download GPO files and then import them. So let me just scroll up here. Did I actually do that elsewhere? Okay. It looks like I didn't finalize this. So Let me pause the video really quick because what this is supposed to do, I have, if I switch back to my Edge browser here, I have the GPOs in GitHub. So I had written part of the script that actually goes out and downloads the GPOs into that location and then imports them from that location. So I'm going to pause and get that fixed here before I run this. That way you can kind of see the start to end configuration, because the GPOs is the last little bit that I was going to get working before I made this video. So be right back. All right, we're back. I got the GPO thing fixed. That actually didn't take that long because I had the code already written in my repo. I just hadn't pushed the changes yet up to repo. So I just copied and pasted and had everything. However, I went and recorded the whole video while having my Edge browser up instead of the RDP window. So re-recording this. I went back and actually I ran this, finished the video with all the configuration, and then had to go delete it. So I should be back to square one, and we should be able to run this and show you guys. But there might be remnants, so I'm hoping not. So, GPO thing is fixed. I've retweaked the OUs to match where we were at before. Let me run this and enter my domain name. Now, I can't remember if I did cover this or not. I don't think I did because I didn't actually run the script. But when you run this, the one thing you get prompted for is enter your domain name. This is the same domain name that you used when you ran the deployment template from Microsoft. So I use contoso.com. Whatever you put into that field for the domain name is what you're going to use. You can check by going to Active Directory and it's listed right there. So that's enter that domain name, hit enter, and you'll get prompted for a password. This password is going to be the password that's set for all the users in your domain. Now, this is written to be a lab environment. I wanted to be able to switch between user contexts, regular users, admin users, and domain admins, and not have to manage a bunch of passwords. So I have it set all passwords to the same password. Obviously not what you would do in prod, but enter the password. It goes through. That is it downloading and importing the GPOs. Like I said, it's downloading those GPOs from my GitHub repository, and then it creates the GPOs to match those, and then it imports those GPOs into group policy. So what we've got now that this is ran, if I open Active Directory and I refresh this, actually I may set my view back. I had to change it to delete things. You've now got the OUs in the script that was defined. So I've got groups. You got the new OU that we added: people, resources, servers, workstations. Resources like service accounts, people is your users, and there is the custom user that we added to the script before we ran it. So Active Directory is good to go. Now if we take a look at group policy, this also comes with 3 GPOs out of the box. It comes with a firewall GPO, which sets settings to allow traffic from that 10.0.0/16 virtual network that you define in the deployment template. If you change that, this isn't going to work, but usually out of the box, firewall is restricted to only allow traffic from the same subnet that the server's in. This expands that to allow it from the virtual network, the /16 network. You also have a GPO here that is configured to add all domain users to the remote desktop users group in your Active Directory. What this does is allows you, if you're deploying multiple servers, you can use any user in this domain to RDP across to other servers. The reason I did this is so that I can test different user contexts and not have to worry about granting them RDP permissions. It's already granted out of the box. Lastly, we have our server admins GPO. What this is doing is for every server you add to the that's in the server's OU, it configures this SEC security server admins group, which is right here. It adds this group to the administrators group on all servers. What this does is then configures your admin users, the -ADM users, to automatically have administrator rights on any of your servers in the server OU. And you remember the script added any users that end with -ADM to this group. So this is essentially configuring your server admin rights out of the box. This is kind of goes hand in hand with that managed AD delegation. Now, there's one last piece to this lab environment that's really important to know. step that you don't want to miss, and that is, what do you do when you're done working with the lab environment, or what do you do if you're done for now, but you want to keep some of the changes you made and you want to be able to pick this up later but not have to pay for that VM while you are not working on it. There's two pieces of this that I want to point out. One, let's switch back to our Edge browser here and show you. Sorry, 1 second. Okay. You are going to be paying for a virtual machine as long as that virtual machine is running. So, if I click into my VM, you'll see the status listed right here, running. You are paying for a VM that is running or stopped. That is important to know, meaning you can't just press stop on a VM and have it and know that you're not going to be paying for it. Actually, that will work, but there's a difference here. There's a third stage for VM. There's running, stopped, and then stopped deallocated. Once a VM has been deallocated, you are no longer paying the cost for that VM. So what does that mean price-wise? It means that you have to pay for storage. If there's disks attached to it, anything that's saved in that, you're paying a little bit per storage. And then you will pay for any remaining load balancer, public IP, any sort of hourly resource that isn't state aware like a VM. However, majority of your cost is coming from the VM. So if you've got a lab environment that you want to save the current config on and you want to come back and pick it up later, but you are going to pause for like a day or two, you can come in here, press stop, and what you're going to see, my VM automatically started shutting down, because what that does is it shuts the VM down and then it deallocates it. So I switch back to CAM. If I refresh, it's going to probably say deallocating. Yep. So this means that VM is getting deallocated and you're no longer going to be paying for it. If I refresh this a couple more times, it takes a couple of seconds for it to work. Oop, I keep pressing the wrong section. Now, this will work just fine for pausing and keeping state. However, if you're like me, I don't want to have to pay for anything if I'm not using it. And part of the reason I'm showing these videos and showing how quick and easy it is to set up is because when I'm done with these labs, I don't deallocate it, I just destroy it. I delete all of my resources, and then when I'm ready to pick up again, I will pick up again from scratch and then build out. Now, most of the time, that doesn't really matter because it just reinforces, if I have to do a setup phase, it reinforces, you'll see that my VM just went to stopped. It reinforces what it takes for me to set that up. It gets me more familiar with it. Otherwise, the actual creating the VM is going to be streamlined. Now, that means literally when I'm done with this, all I have to do, check these boxes and the VNet, go to delete. It's going to prompt you, enter delete, bam, bam, and it's going to delete these resources. Now, a couple things to note: if you do this, chances are it's not going to be able to delete everything on the first pass, and that's because there's things like you can't delete a virtual network while things are still attached to it. So if it tries to delete the VNet, but your network interface still exists, then it's going to error out. However, if you press delete, it will try and delete as many as it can. Sometimes you have to delete this 2 or 3 times to get everything to remove. It's a little tedious, but now I'm not paying for anything that's left over in my lab environment. This all leads into the next video, though, because the next video is where things get really interesting. Rather than going to the Microsoft Quickstart template, pressing a button, filling out your variables, deploying everything, and then running a script after it's deployed to configure Active Directory, part 2 is going to show you how you can automate everything from start to finish. We are going to take the deployment details we created today, we're going to package those, and then bring them into Terraform. We're going to use Terraform to deploy the same Active Directory domain controller. We're going to use DSC, a modified DSC, to not just install Active Directory like the template was doing, but also to run our Active Directory configurations after the fact. Then we also we customize it a little bit so it doesn't need the load balancer, so it's saving us a little bit of cost. And then last last thing is we can then customize our Terraform very simply to deploy multiple servers if we want. So we will then out of the gate be deploying a management server and a domain controller, but then you can add variables to Terraform to deploy however many other servers you want to spin up at once, and it gives you a lot of flexibility then if you want to have kind of a more robust lab environment than just a single domain controller. The last thing, the last advantage that gets you is here we had to come in and delete. It looks like it successfully deleted everything this time. That's great. It doesn't always do that. But it saves you this step because rather than coming in here, checking a bunch of boxes, pressing delete, from your desktop, all you have to do is type in terraform destroy, and all the resources you created will instantly then be destroyed, and you are back to square zero, and that makes it really easy to spin things up and tear things down and give you a really dynamic lab environment that you can have on demand. I'm going to run a quick preview of what that deployment looks like, how easy it is, and that will be leading into our part 2 video. So follow that. I would highly recommend, if you're planning on doing this, to go the full advanced configuration, even if it's a little intimidating, because of the flexibility it offers you. Here's that preview. This is going to be the deployment. This is the Active Directory deployment that it's doing to deploy the domain controller and your Active Directory domain. It's got all these values printed out here. Then you've got your public IP and your NSG rules. So all that looks good. You're probably going to see exactly the same thing when you do this. The last step we have to do here is type terraform apply. Terraform apply is what actually creates the resources. So, okay, we can see that our Terraform deployment here is finished. It's showing that everything was created successfully. And the last thing that Terraform is configured to do is it spits out, once the deployment is complete, the public IP address that was created for you so that you know what you can use to connect. So I've got this right here. Let me copy this and let's go ahead and connect here to our environment. So I'm going to paste that here, and notice, or just a reminder, I've got my username right there, and I've got my domain name right there. So let's connect. Let's do cryptoso.com. That's the domain name. / my admin username that I created. Whoops. And the password. And right there, form. And in one command, terraform destroy, it will take everything that you've created with Terraform, so the 2 servers, management and back P1, your domain controller, your template that you used to deploy it, everything you've created, it will now go out and destroy that thing. Easy as can be.